Dr. Matthew D. Taylor is a visiting scholar at the Center on Faith and Justice at Georgetown University. He's the author of Scripture People, published in 2023, The Violent Take It by Force in 2024, and the forthcoming book, Defying Tyrants, which will be published in October. His work has appeared or been featured in the New York Times, Weekend Edition, On the Media, Rolling Stone, The Bulwark, Politico, Sojourners, and the Religion News Service. A theologian and a religious studies scholar who specializes in American Islam, Christian nationalism, and Christian extremism, he is also the creator of 2 limited podcast series, American Unexceptionalism and Charismatic Revival Theory. Taylor holds a PhD from Georgetown University and an MA from Fuller Theological Seminary. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Taylor to the stage.
Good evening. Thank you for coming out this evening. I am honored to be here with you in Colorado Springs, one of the great homes of modern evangelicalism, and I'm really grateful for the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism and Jeff Scholes and all of you who made this possible. So I'm going to try to timestamp this. We are in May of 2025. We are just over a year into the second Trump administration. And I'm going to pose a confrontational question tonight. Has evangelical Christianity become a threat to American democracy? So let me give a little outline for where I want to go in our time together. I'm going to start with a gallery of curious prayer photos, some of which you may have seen before. And then I want to try to define our terms a little bit. What do we mean when we say evangelical Christianity? What is American democracy? And what does it mean to pose a threat to a democracy? And then I'm going to spend most of our time doing some storytelling. And I want to tell you the little-known backstory of how evangelical Christians came to support and embrace Donald Trump, and how that leads into January 6th and the events of January 6th of the Capitol riot. And that really is the story of my book, The Violent Take It by Force. And then what I want to do for the rest of our time, though, is actually move from January 6th up to the present. How do we get to today? How do we get to the present Trump administration and its priorities? And then I'll try to come back to this question of that is in the title at the end, evaluating where American democracy stands today and assessing whether evangelical Christianity does indeed pose a threat to it. So let's start with some prayer photos. You know, if you have been paying attention to the news or watching on social media, you probably have seen some of these photos. You can find dozens of them now, beginning in the fall of 2015 and continuing right up until the present, of Christian leaders surrounding Donald Trump and praying over him. Often they're laying hands on him, as you can see. Some of these photos are from the Oval Office, some from other rooms in the White House, and I have searched and searched, and I cannot find similar photos of George W. Bush, who identified as an evangelical, of his father, George H.W. Bush, or Ronald Reagan, any of the 3 previous Republican presidents. I found one picture of Coretta Scott King praying with George W. Bush at a distance, but not of any leaders laying hands on these leaders, on these presidents. You can even find photos and videos of Christian leaders, and actually a fairly ethnically diverse array of Christian leaders praying and prophesying over Donald Trump. We'll talk about that. Indeed, in the days before the 2024 election, a number of these photos came out and became public. This was a big part of selling Donald Trump as the Christian candidate in that. And since he was inaugurated last January, we've gotten a few more of these photos from the Oval Office. So in what follows, I'd like to get to the bottom of these photos. Who are these leaders? There's many repeat faces. You might not have been able to see it at the distance, but many of the same faces occurring over and over in these photos. Why are they praying over Donald Trump? How did they get this kind of access to the White House and to the former and current president? And why has Donald Trump, who is a notorious germaphobe, does not like to be touched, why has he consented to taking so many of these photos with dozens of people laying hands on him? Before we get there, let's try to define some terms. What do we mean by democracy? This is my slightly modified dictionary definition of democracy. It's a governing order in which the people, the demos, made up of all eligible citizens, exercises rule over society through elections and elected representatives. Now, sometimes you'll find Americans who will make a distinction between a democracy, where people vote for policies directly, and a republic, where people elect representatives to enact certain policies. But if you look on a global scale, that's kind of a distinction without a difference. That's kind of an American nuance that nobody else really cares about. So we're talking about democracy in general here, right? And if you want to call it a republic, go ahead. Now, in contemporary political science, there's a pretty basic distinction that is made between what is called liberal democracy and illiberal democracy. I think Fareed Zakaria was the first to come up with this distinction. Now, importantly, liberal here does not refer to liberal versus conservative in the way that we typically use that word today. It's liberal referring to preservation of liberties, right? The values of a free society. And so what is being contrasted in liberal versus illiberal democracy is basically autocracy or authoritarianism versus democracy. And so here we have a data set. This is from the VDEM Institute, the Varieties of Democracy Institute, which is in Sweden. It's a group of political scientists and social scientists who, they've got like 450 different matrices and kind of variables that they're looking at for all kind of global democracies. And then they put them onto this map in terms of where they scale on the level of democracy. So the darker blues are liberal democracies. This is the 2024 data set. And then as you move more towards this kind of pale yellow, those are the illiberal democracies or autocracies. So a liberal democracy, what do we mean by that? It's a society that has fair elections with multiple parties contesting those elections. The separation of powers, what we in the US sometimes call checks and balances, right? There are distinct branches of government that have autonomy from each other and are enacting the will of the people through different ways and holding each other in check. They have the rule of law, an independent justice system, protections for human rights and for freedom of speech. That's what we mean when we call something a liberal democracy. Now, an illiberal democracy is very different from that. It has the trappings of a democracy, but they're severely limited. So these are societies that can range from an outright autocratic state with sham elections all the way to more kind of backsliding democracies that have a consolidated one-party rule where there's not actually a real contestation of elections. And formal democratic institutions can often exist in an illiberal democracy, but there's very little of this separation of powers. Everything kind of revolves around one leader or one party. And they start to curtail human rights and liberties and start moving away from those protections of a free society. Now, I think we have to recognize that most nations in the world today, in part because of norms that were established after World War II, at least claim to be democracies, right? Russia claims to be a democracy. They have elections. They just all happen to go Vladimir Putin's way, and if you happen to run against him, you'll probably end up dead, right? So again, there's a pretense of democracy. I don't think any of us in this room would want to trade what we have in the United States for the Russian democracy. Let me make a few points on democracy before we get into the backdrop of these photos. It's important to recognize that democracy is not a binary on-off switch. It's not like a society goes one day from being a democracy and then, boop, oh, now we're no longer a democracy. It's a dimmer switch. It goes up and down. It scales. It moves across this kind of continuum that the VDEM data is trying to capture. And the United States historically has gone through periods of democratic growth. I think especially when we look at the kind of post-Civil War Reconstruction era and some of the amendments that were added to our Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, as well. But we've also gone through periods of democratic backsliding. Right after Reconstruction, you have this retrenchment in the South, the growth of the Jim Crow South. I think there was a real backsliding from that high point after the Civil War until the Civil Rights Movement. came in and started to restore a lot of the access to those amendments that were passed. And liberal democracies have evolved various ways of relating to religious traditions and the establishment of religion. Establishment just means having an official religion. And there are some forms of religious nationalism that are compatible with liberal democracy, and there are others that are not. I would say that the epitome of Christian nationalism, if we wanted to get out of our kind of parochial American context, is the coronation of the King of England. You have the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the church, putting the crown literally on the head of the king as all of the assembled nobles and muckety-mucks of British society sing hymns about the glories of the patriarchy and of the monarchy, right? Is this a threat to British democracy? I don't think it really is. This is kind of a vestigial ceremony. It doesn't have much of an impact. I mean, in many ways, it's kind of, I think Americans are more interested and entertained by the ceremony than Brits are, right? And so it's just this kind of vestigial holdover, but it's still a form of Christian nationalism. Now, religious movements that do threaten democracy, I would say, are those, and I have 4 different possible ways that they can threaten a democracy. They could privilege one community's citizenship over others and say, members of our religious community are the real citizens in this country, and everyone else has to have a second-class form of citizenship. They can use demonization and threats of violence to bring authoritarian leaders to power, kind of a propaganda function. They can sacralize, which just means to make holy, or baptize an authoritarian's agenda in theology to make it seem as though it's God or the God's agenda. And in extreme cases, religious movements can cause an authoritarian leader to go mad with power, with delusions of grandeur and invincibility. And this is an observable pattern. Authoritarians want to use religion as a tool, but over time it can start to go to their heads. Now, what do we mean by American evangelicalism? I am going to take the privilege of being in Colorado Springs to just nerd out for a minute on how we define evangelicalism, because this is maybe the only place where I really get to do that. I would contend that there are 3 major contemporary approaches to defining evangelicalism. It's a very hard movement to define, very, very diverse, a lot of different expressions. Option 1 is a kind of more scholarly definition. This comes from the historian David Bebbington, and it's called Bebbington's Quadrilateral, where he names 4 different thematic dimensions that he says are contiguous across all dimensions and all expressions of evangelicalism in the UK and the US across a number of centuries. And so the 4 that he identifies are, and he likes to make up words. So the first one is crucicentrism, which is just basically a central focus on the cross of Christ and what happens at the cross of Christ. Biblicism, which is this kind of central fixation on the Bible and putting the Bible's authority over all other kind of forms of knowledge. Conversionism, which is basically that people have to convert. You have to make a conscious decision. This is where we get this language of being born again. That's the conscious decision to convert and to inhabit this tradition. And then the 4th is activism. He didn't make that one up. And that's just putting your faith into action in the world. And so Bebbington would say, when you have the confluence of those 4 qualities, then you're looking at something that's evangelical. The problem is there's a lot of other things that have those 4 qualities that wouldn't necessarily be evangelical. And so it's not a very precise definition. Now, option 2, and this is what Pew Research Center uses, is that evangelical is basically a form of self-branding. And so when Pew does its various surveys, they'll just kind of ask, do you identify as evangelical or born again? And then they take what portion of Protestants identify that way, and that's how many evangelicals there are. And that phrase, though, it's interesting because increasingly what Pew has been finding is an increasing number of Catholics as well as Muslims have been saying yes to this question, do you identify as evangelical or born again? So they just lopped all those people off. They're like, those aren't evangelicals. You have to be Protestant. They cut those people out. And they also cut out any black Protestants who identify with black churches. And it shakes out then, in their definition, to around 25% of the U.S. population, by Pew's definition, are evangelical. They brand themselves that way. Now, the third option, and this is what is used by the Public Religion Research Institute today, they want to say that evangelical is intrinsically a religio-racial category. It blends race and religion. And so they would say, they ask the same question that Pew asks, do you identify as evangelical or born again? But they only count people who are white who say yes to that as evangelicals. And so all white Protestants who self-identify as evangelical or born again cashes out to around 13% of the U.S. population. Now, I think each of these definitions can be useful in certain circumstances. They all have their benefits. But I'm going to offer a different way of defining evangelicalism or thinking about it tonight. And this is a 4-quadrant model. Let me explain this briefly. So there's 2 guiding questions in this model. One is the expression that we're seeing of Christianity denominational? And the other one is the expression we're looking at charismatic. Let me explain why I use those 2. So denominations are how, especially American Protestants, have historically solved the problem of Protestant schismatic nature. We're always kind of breaking apart. We're always separating. We're always fighting, and we have to go found new churches. And denominations are the way that we hold together churches. They're kind of organizational, kind of semi-democratic governance structures that have bylaws and committees and somewhat democratic governance. And when we say charismatic here, we're not using that in the kind of generic sense of somebody having a magnetic personality. We're using it in the specific Christian sense of a spirituality that's built around trying to access the supernatural dimensions of early Christianity. These are Christians who speak in tongues, who believe in prophecy, who believe in modern miracles. So if you map these kind of yes, no, using those 2 criteria, what you get are 4 different quadrants. And quadrant 1 would be yes, denominational, non-charismatic. This is where most of us, I think of American Christianity being centered. Most Catholics would fit within this quadrant. Most mainline Protestants, there's a few mainline Protestants that are charismatic, but not very many. But kind of by definition, to be a mainline Protestant, you have to belong to a mainline denomination. Most historically black Protestants, especially the antebellum black denominations, would be here. And then what I call classical evangelicals, Southern Baptists, Presbyterian Church of America, evangelical free. Now, quadrant 2, right, if you're going across, would be non-denominational and non-charismatic. So there's a very old American impulse to resist this idea of denominations that's seen as inauthentic. So these are kind of authentic biblical Christians, usually identify as evangelical. And in the history of evangelicalism in the United States, for a long time there was a split between fundamentalism and evangelicalism, and then they all kind of merged together after 9/11. And so these are kind of the post-fundamentalists, still kind of schismatic, don't really want to merge with anybody, don't want to join a denomination, but they're not charismatic. If you're familiar with kind of the evangelical landscape, I think John MacArthur perfectly typifies kind of quadrant 2. Quadrant 3 is where you have the juncture of charismatic spirituality and denominational governance, and this is where you find what we would call Pentecostals. Right? Most Pentecostals in the U.S. belong to a Pentecostal denomination, these historic denominations that came out of especially the Azusa Street revival in the early 20th century. You also have a burgeoning movement of charismatic Catholics, burgeoning somewhat in the U.S. Amy Coney Barrett, the Supreme Court Justice, is a charismatic Catholic, grew up in that community, but it's also growing rapidly around the world. There are a few charismatic mainline Protestant churches. They're shrinking, but there's still a few. And this quadrant kind of contains the energy of that charismatic spirituality within the structure of denominations. And then we get to the 4th quadrant, and that's where we're going to spend most of our time tonight. This is where you have the juncture of charismatic spirituality and non-denominational governance. We, in the scholarly world, call these the independent charismatics. This huge growth in the sector since the 1970s and 1980s, really the cutting edge of American Christianity is happening in the 4th quadrant. Now, very hard to measure the 4th quadrant because a lot of our surveys don't ask if people are charismatic, but it's very influential, and we'll talk about how we see them tonight. But I want to just point out, you would find evangelicals in every one of these quadrants. You'd find other kinds of Christians in them as well, but you'd find evangelicals in every one of these quadrants. But they're different kinds of evangelicals. So quadrant 1, I would call kind of the evangelical establishment. A lot of the organizations we find in a place like Colorado Springs would be quadrant 1 organizations. Quadrant 2 are these kind of post-fundamentalist schismatics, the kind of rough around the edges evangelicals. Quadrant 3 would be these kind of measured legacy charismatics, the old school charismatics. And then quadrant 4 are these upstart, the unregulated charismatics. So I want to use this as a way to kind of think about how Donald Trump came to be president. But let me just sit on this 4th quadrant for a minute and help you get a little better grasp of it. So what does it mean how do you know that you're encountering an independent charismatic church? Well, this is the fastest growing segment of American Christianity and of global Christianity. The Center for the Study of World Christianity at Gordon Conwell College or Gordon Conwell Seminary They estimate that in 1970, it's kind of hard to read the chart, but in 1970, they estimate that there were 44 million independent charismatics in the world. By 2020, their estimate was up to 312 million. So we're talking about a sector of Christianity that's roughly doubling in size every 20 years globally right now. That would make it one of the fastest growing religious movements in global history. It's ethnically diverse and globally connected. This is not strictly a kind of white evangelical space. It's very multi-ethnic, very, very invested in kind of global concerns, not purely kind of parochial American concerns. One of the markers is that they believe in modern prophecy. Now, many Christians believe in biblical prophecy, that there are passages in the Bible that allude to events that have not yet happened, right? So the idea that Jesus will return is a biblical prophecy. These folks believe in that. They also believe in modern prophecy, that there are living prophets who walk among us, who hear directly from God and speak the words of God to communities and individuals and even to world leaders. They have a very strong emphasis on what they call spiritual warfare. And spiritual warfare, again, very simply is the idea that there are angels and demons battling all around us in an invisible spiritual realm for control over humanity and over the earth. Now, again, many Christians believe in spiritual warfare. These folks take it and they just ratchet it up to the highest degree. And they'll organize campaigns of spiritual warfare. And they believe that through practicing spiritual warfare, they can beat back the forces of Satan and actually conquer territory. Now, again, they're non-denominational, so they're not tied to any of these denominational or accountability structures. There's a little bit more of the Wild West when we're talking about the independent charismatics. Yet, when we talk about them as non-denominational, I think sometimes the impression that forms in our mind, because when we hear the term non-denominational, we think of it as the absence of something. They're not denominational, and so therefore they're just kind of amorphous and undefined. But actually what you find when you study this world is they have a very highly networked celebrity and leadership culture globally. And so even though they're all running their autonomous ministries, even though they have their own churches that are not attached to each other, the leaders of this world are all interconnected and all share a common media culture that actually runs around the globe. I sometimes refer to the fourth quadrant as the Silicon Valley of the American church. Very innovative, very entrepreneurial, very tech savvy. These folks are prolifically online on YouTube and social media. Not a lot of regulation, not a lot of wisdom, not a lot of tradition. They're the kind of move fast and break things Christians. So how did Trump gain such fervent evangelical support? And where do these photos come from? So I'm going to tell, for especially the first part here, I'm going to really kind of walk through. I tell this story in The Violent Taken by Force, but I don't tell it kind of chronologically there. I do it through a series of biographies of some of the leaders who become very pivotal around January 6th. But here I'm going to try to tell you the story front to back. And we're going to start in the 1940s and 1950s. Now, a lot of places you could start telling this story, but I'm going to start there, and I'll begin in 1948. This is the end of World War II, the formation of the United Nations, the founding of the State of Israel. And in 1948, there's a Pentecostal revival that kicks off in Saskatchewan, Canada, in North Battlefield, called the Latter Rain Revival, sometimes called the New Order of the Latter Rain. And it spreads from Canada out around the world, spreads to the U.S., actually spreads around the world. So Hillsong Church, which some of you might have heard of, is downstream of the Latter Rain. And part of what shapes the Latter Rain, part of their theology is they believe in something called fivefold ministry. This comes from Ephesians chapter 4, where the author of Ephesians says or writes, "So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up." And within the Latter Rain groups, they received prophecies. They believe in modern prophecy. And so they were prophets in their group who prophesied that we have three of these offices that are active in the church: the evangelists, the pastors, and the teachers. We're missing apostles and prophets. But God, according to their prophecies, would restore the offices of the apostle and the prophet in the 20th century, and that would lead to a grand global revival that would renew Christianity around the world. But the Latter Rain leaders are considered quite extreme in Pentecostal denominations. In fact, the largest of the Pentecostal denominations, the Assemblies of God, rejects the Latter Rain. And in fact, in a 1949 General Council, even denounces the Latter Rain and say, "We disapprove of those extreme teachings and practices of the so-called New Order of the Latter Rain." And the biggest thing they're objecting to is this idea of modern-day apostles and prophets. And so the Latter Rain leaders are kind of forced out of the Pentecostal denominations, and they move out into the independent charismatic hinterlands, this wilderness of non-denominational charismatic churches. Now, fast forward about 20 years, and you come to the late 1960s, and roughly from around 1967 to 72, there's another series of revivals called the Jesus People, or the Jesus Movement revivals. Again, charismatic revivals, often steeped in Pentecostal spirituality, and this brings legions of eager new converts into this non-denominational charismatic space. It really kind of starts bulking out in the late 60s and into the 70s. Now, the Jesus People is mostly centered in California, and is actually out of the Jesus People movement that you get the modern contemporary Christian music and worship music industry. Most of the artists and outfits that are putting forward Christian worship music today are independent charismatic. It's the sector that shapes evangelical worship music. You also get movements like Messianic Judaism that comes out of the Jesus People movement. And in the 1980s, you start to have some of these latter rain ideas filtered through Jesus People, filtered through some of the other things that are going on, and people start naming themselves apostles and prophets, hearkening back to the latter rain ideas. And there's a group of them that gather in Kansas City, appropriately called the Kansas City Prophets, and around a figure named Mike Bickle. And they go on to create the International House of Prayer in Kansas City, which has recently imploded, but was a very important institution for a number of years. So these things are percolating in the 80s. And there's a seminary professor named C. Peter Wagner who's watching all this happen. And Wagner is a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary. He's a professor of what's called church growth. Church growth is the idea, very popular in certain evangelical circles, that you could blend the theology of evangelicalism with the data of the social sciences and produce growth in churches, in missionary movements, that if you really paid attention, you could merge these things. And this was one of the big spurs for the modern megachurch movement. And Wagner was very influential in that sector. But in 1989, throughout the 80s, he's becoming fascinated with these independent charismatics. And in 1989, he meets a woman named Cindy Jacobs, who claims that she's a prophet. She's one of these latter rain characters. And he comes to become friends with her. She almost becomes an adopted daughter to him. And he becomes convinced that there's something very profound happening in this independent charismatic space. And so he and Jacob start working together. They organize the prayer efforts for something called the 1040 Window campaign, if you've heard of that. This was a very important in evangelicalism in the 1990s, an effort, a missionary movement focused on this space. You can kind of see it in the box there. It's between 10 degrees north latitude and 40 degrees north latitude across North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. This is the least Christian part of the globe. And so the 1040 Window campaign is an effort to send missionaries and to pray for the 1040 Window. Massive, tens of millions of Christians around the globe praying for the 1040 Window. If you were around certain evangelical circles in the 1990s, this stuff was ubiquitous. And Wagner and Jacobs were leading these prayer efforts, coordinating hundreds of thousands, even millions of people praying for this missions movement. And Wagner also became fascinated with these ideas of spiritual warfare and hearing things and some of these prophecies from Cindy Jacobs. And so they started collaborating. And in the early 90s, another leader in this movement, a guy named Dutch Sheets, moves to Colorado Springs, and Cindy Jacobs follows him to Colorado Springs. And he's leading a church called Spring Harvest Fellowship, which evolved over time to become Freedom Church today. And so they're gathering here in Colorado Springs, and they're writing all these books about spiritual warfare, about prayer. Wagner comes to believe that not only should Christians be doing spiritual warfare, but there's actually a hierarchy of demons. There are kind of ground level demons that most of us deal with, but there are also what he calls territorial spirits. And these are high-level demons, commander-level demons, who can command the demon forces in kind of a military campaign style. And he says that territorial spirits can control literal physical territory and human institutions. And we need to organize mass campaigns of spiritual warfare to displace these territorial spirits. In fact, as they're doing this 1040 Window thing, they come to the idea late in the 1040 Window campaign, around 1996 or 1997, that there's a territorial spirit named the Queen of Heaven, who has a spiritual fortress on the slopes of Mount Everest. And so they organize a strike team of leaders from their circle. Cindy Jacobs helps to train them. Doris Wagner, Peter's wife, is one of the leaders on this trip. And they send a team of 27 individuals to the slopes of Mount Everest for 3 weeks to do battle against the Queen of Heaven, to pray and intercede. One of the members of this team almost dies in the process. And they write books about this afterwards, about how they helped to dethrone the Queen of Heaven, and that now prayer and evangelism can move forward in Central Asia. This all sounds kooky, but I will note some of the members from that 27-person team that went up the slopes of Mount Everest in 1997 show up on January 6th at the Capitol. And they're doing the same practices there. So in 1996, Wagner organizes a gathering, a colloquium at Fuller Seminary called the National Symposium on the Post-Denominational Church. He likes this phrase, post-denominational. He's kind of thinking that might be a way to name this phenomenon that he's seeing. And as he's meeting more and more of these friends of Dutch Sheets and Cindy Jacobs, they start to kind of gather around Peter Wagner as their mentor. And he comes to believe, Peter does, this Fuller Seminary professor, mainstream evangelical guy, comes to believe that he himself is one of these latter-day apostles. And he's receiving prophecies from Cindy Jacobs and others who are telling him, you are going to be the catalyst for this global revival. And in 1996, they coined the phrase, the New Apostolic Reformation, to describe this revival they believe will be led by apostles and prophets, will transform the world through spiritual warfare, and will renew the church. And they think it's going to be a reformation on the order of the Protestant Reformation in terms of the impact it will have on Christianity. Now, in 1999, Wagner retires from Fuller Seminary and goes to go build this New Apostolic Reformation thing full time. And so he's still here in Colorado Springs. He's here almost until his death in 2016. And so he starts to organize networks of these leaders who are all identifying as apostles and prophets, all wanting to be a part of this New Apostolic Reformation program, headquartered here in Colorado Springs. There's 7 or 8 different institutions. They're all pretty low profile. These are just kind of like low-grade networks, more personal relationships than anything else. But they have these names like the Eagles Vision Apostolic Team or the International Coalition of Apostles, the Apostolic Council of Prophetic Elders. And they're taking these latter rain ideas of apostles and prophets and Wagner's own ideas about spiritual warfare and merging those together. And the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation, begins as a reform movement, an ecclesiological reform movement to transform the church. But then, over time, this other guy comes into the movement, a guy named Lance Wallnau. And Lance Wallnau he's also steeped in latter rain ideas, and he believes that he has a special prophecy for the church, and it's called the Seven Mountain Mandate. And the Seven Mountain Mandate is the idea that you can divide every society up into 7 different arenas of cultural authority: government, religion, education, arts and entertainment, media. And then each of those arenas they imagine as a mountain. And the tops of those mountains, and you can start to see how this synchronizes with these other ideas, the tops of those mountains are either controlled by the demons and by Satan or by God and the Christians. And there's no in between. It's a totally Manichaean vision of society. And either Satan controls the government, and the demons do, or the Christians do, governing on behalf of God. And the mandate is for Christians to go and take over the 7 mountains, to go and take power in each of these arenas of society, locally and nationally. And this is in every society. This is not only an American idea. And so this shifts the NAR identity. It moves from being an ecclesiological reform movement into being a movement aimed at world conquest. And so they start to write books about the 7 mountains, and about they adopt this idea of dominion theology. 7 Mountains is a version of dominion theology. So Peter Wagner writes his most controversial book, Dominion. It comes out in 2008. And these NAR leaders, they're very prolific in publishing. They're getting their ideas out there all over the place. And they're branding these like 7 Mountains ideas and dominion. And then in 2008, John McCain picks a woman named Sarah Palin to be the vice presidential candidate. And Sarah Palin has been living in these NAR worlds and ideas for a very long time. She was mentored by an NAR prophet named Mary Glazier in Alaska for most of her political career. And so their belief is, hey, we're supposed to be conquering the 7 mountains. We want to take the government mountain. Look, God is opening the doors for us to do that in 2008. And they become very excited about Palin, and of course, then they lose. And so throughout the early 2010s, throughout the Obama presidency, they are kind of holding themselves at bay, imagining these ideas of the future, becoming very disillusioned and frustrated with the Obama administration. Peter Wagner retires in 2010 and hands off leadership of a lot of this stuff to his mentees, his inner circle. And it's in 2013 that Dutch Sheets believes that he receives another prophecy. He's at a kind of graduation ceremony for a Bible college that he's leading in Texas, and he is given a flag on stage. It's a flag from American history. It's a white flag with a green pine tree at the center and the phrase, "an appeal to heaven." across the top. This is a Revolutionary War flag, actually. It was commissioned by George Washington to fly over the Massachusetts Navy. It's kind of an artifact of American history, a piece of Americana that most people have never even heard of or seen. Maybe some history buffs have. But Dutch Sheets believes it's a prophecy. And it's a prophecy, it's a symbol of a spiritual warfare campaign to remake America, to once again appeal to heaven, to re-envision the United States, to a new spiritual revolution. Dutch Sheets was very opposed to the Obama administration and believed that Barack Obama himself was a Muslim. And he believed that we were living under liberal tyranny and we need a new revolution. And so he starts branding this flag, starts popularizing, starts sharing it with other people, and he writes a whole book called An Appeal to Heaven, and this becomes a campaign of spiritual warfare to retake the country. A couple of years later, Donald Trump hits the political scene. And as he's coming into the political scene, as he rides down the golden escalator, as he's entering the campaign, he turns to his most trusted spiritual advisor, a woman named Paula White Cain. Paula White Cain is a fourth quadrant leader. She's an independent charismatic. She's a televangelist. She's got a mega church. She's a prosperity gospel preacher. And Trump asks her, he says, I want you to be my liaison to the evangelicals. But this creates an interesting quandary for Paula White Cain. She's not a normal evangelical. She's a fourth quadrant evangelical. And they're seen as kind of the fringy, weird evangelicals. And so she does not have James Dobson on her speed dial. She doesn't have the old leaders of the religious right in access to her. And so she starts bringing in her kind of leaders, her kind of Christian evangelists and apostles and prophets and megachurch pastors and messianic rabbis. And these are the first religious leaders to meet with Donald Trump, starting in the fall of 2015. And one of the people in that first meeting is Lance Wallnau, the Seven Mountains guy. And he claims that he receives a prophecy about Donald Trump in that first meeting, that Donald Trump is a latter-day Cyrus. He's like the Emperor Cyrus in the Bible, a secular figure, a heathen figure even, but one anointed by God for a very special purpose to save God's people. And so this becomes a part of the framing around Donald Trump. Now, it's hard to remember now, but in the 2016 campaign, mainstream evangelicals didn't like Trump. The evangelical establishment, the religious right establishment, they didn't like Trump. The elites of the quadrants 1 through 3 didn't want Trump. They weren't supporting him. And so it was these independent charismatic leaders who surround Trump, who propagandize him, who give positive theological messages of support for him. And as the campaign proceeds, Peter Wagner actually endorses Trump, and he's dying in 2016. He's moving towards his death in October of 2016. But in February, he endorses Donald Trump. This is in the midst of the primaries. And Lance Wallnau writes an entire book, God's Chaos Candidate, that gets published about a month before the election, prophesying that Donald Trump is God's chosen leader for America. Peter Wagner dies about 2 weeks before the 2016 election, and he casts his absentee vote for Donald Trump from his hospice bed. It's one of the last acts that he does in his life. And when Trump wins, Peter Wagner's act and, of course, Lance Wallnau's prophecies are seen as them having great foresight, that they predicted what nobody else did. And so Trump takes Paula White and these kind of NAR leaders who are in his orbit, and he makes them the nucleus of his evangelical advisors. These are the Christian leaders that are surrounding Donald Trump, that are advising him, that are meeting with him, sometimes talking to him about policy, sometimes praying over him, sometimes prophesying over him, the way that Wallnau did. And so they become the inner circle around him. This is where this genre of photos comes from. Starting in the fall of 2015, it's independent charismatic leaders who have the practice of laying hands on people when they pray over them. And so that's what they do with Trump. And they have surrounded him. This is the culture, the spiritual culture that emerges around Donald Trump. And these charismatic prophecies about Trump continue to accumulate. Lance Wallnau is not the only one. By the 2020 election, there's hundreds of these prophecies specifically about Donald Trump, comparing him to different biblical figures and about his special destiny in the world. Throughout the first Trump administration, the NAR leaders become interlocutors with the White House, special advisors to the White House. In fact, there are even prayer calls commissioned by the White House with people like Dutch Sheets leading the call on behalf of the White House with people like Mike Pence on the call about nuclear negotiations with Kim Jong-un. And they're organizing big conferences about spiritual warfare and doing spiritual warfare on behalf of Trump. And let me just make something clear here. What they are saying is Donald Trump is God's instrument, and his agenda is God's agenda. He's on the side of the angels. And if you oppose Trump, then you're aligned with the demons. Anyone who opposes him must be aligned with the forces of evil. In November of 2019, Paula White King becomes an official White House employee, and one of the first acts that she does is to commission a prayer movement. As a White House employee, called the One Voice Prayer Movement, led by NAR leaders, all focused on helping Trump get elected again in 2020. And in 2020, these prophecies just keep surfacing about Trump throughout the 2020 campaign. Hundreds of independent charismatic prophecies. In fact, about 2 weeks before the 2020 election, Trump is campaigning in Nevada, and he goes to an NAR church, the International Church of Las Vegas, and it's a husband and wife pastors. The husband's the apostle, the wife is the prophet. And at the beginning of the service, the wife and the other prophets in the congregation get up and they prophesy over Trump from the stage, saying, "We have prophecies that you are going to win this election." And then in the sermon, the apostle gets up and he holds up an appeal to heaven flag and he says, "I've seen this flag over the White House. This is a sign of your victory. The armies of heaven are fighting for you, President Trump." It's a few days after this encounter that Donald Trump, in an interview, declares that he is no longer a Presbyterian, the denomination he was raised in. He's now non-denominational. Of course, Trump loses the 2020 election and refuses to concede. And these prophets, these hundreds of prophets whose reputation is on the line, start to say, well, he's not conceding. This is not over. We still know who God wants to win the 2020 election. It still needs to happen. The prophecies are true. We need to do spiritual warfare to put Trump back in office. And so they start organizing a campaign of spiritual warfare through all their media channels, all their podcasts, all their televangelism shows to try to get Trump reinstated. This is the kind of spiritual complement to the Stop the Steal campaign. And in fact, just a few days before January 6th, at the end of December of 2020, Dutch Sheets leads a team of about 15 apostles and prophets from the NAR. They do a prayer tour of Washington, D.C., and they end with a 2-hour meeting in the White House. And the details of that meeting have never really surfaced. But some of the leaders come out of it saying, we were talking about strategy with people in the know at the highest levels of the U.S. government, and you're not going to believe what's coming in the next few days. It's just a few days before January 6th. On January 6th, there's a rally the day before January 6th, on January 5th, and Che On, one of the major NAR apostles, speaks at this rally in Washington, D.C. of the people who are gathering for January 6th. And what he says there, he says in part in his speech, we, as in conservative Christians, are going to rule and reign through President Trump and under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And from here on out, this will be a Republican nation. The other people speaking at that rally were people like Michael Flynn and Alex Jones and Roger Stone. On January 6th, I have tracked more than 60 independent charismatic Christian leaders who were in Washington, D.C. that day. They were magnetized by this appeal of spiritual warfare. They believed it was going to be the culminating battle in this great campaign. And it ranged from local pastors to at least 5 members of Wagner's Inner Circle, this Eagles Vision apostolic team. And if you watch and look at what is going on around the U.S. Capitol that day, you see Christians singing and praying and doing spiritual warfare, participating in all these practices that Peter Wagner and his circle have been working on for years. In fact, Cindy Jacobs helps to lead a group of these leaders, of about 30 of them, just off-site from the U.S. Capitol, leading worship, doing spiritual warfare, prophesying over the Capitol. Dutch Sheets even calls in on a conference call, and they project his voice over the speakerphone, over their megaphones, to prophesy over the Capitol in the middle of the riot. Lance Wallnau was supposed to speak at one of the rallies that day. This is the rally that got canceled. It was supposed to happen at the Capitol building in the afternoon, and it got canceled because the rioting started. But this was intended to keep pushing the members of Congress to elect Trump. And when you look around the crowds on January 6th, you see these appeal to heaven flags everywhere. There are dozens of them, maybe even hundreds. They're gathering at the Trump rally at the Ellipse, around the Washington Monument as they march across the National Mall, moving towards the Capitol. You see them on the front lines as crowds start to skirmish with the Capitol Police. In fact, there's video of one of these appeal to heaven flags on a tent pole being used to beat down on Capitol Police officers. We know of at least one of the rioters who wore his appeal to heaven flag around his neck as a cape into the Capitol. And when he was arrested by the police later, they found the appeal to heaven flag in his home, and it was spattered with blood and with mace. And he said, "That's not my blood." After January 6th, these folks do not abandon Trump. They keep prophesying and endorsing him and blessing him. In fact, there's a gathering of these folks in 2023 in Atlanta with about 10,000 people, and they read a Watchman decree, this kind of almost legal declaration that was written by Dutch Sheets. And let me read a portion of it just to give you a sense of what they're saying. Whereas we, the church, are God's governing body on the earth, we have been given legal power from heaven and now exercise our authority. We decree that we take back and permanently control positions of influence and leadership in each of the 7 mountains. We will never stop fighting. We will never, ever, ever give up or give in. We will take our country back. And in that period of the Biden presidency, we see these appeal to heaven flags continue to proliferate. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito flew one outside his summer home in the summer of 2023. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, flies one outside of his congressional office. He started that before he became Speaker of the House and has continued ever since. It was given to him by an NAR pastor. And we start to see neo-Nazis adopting this symbol as well and flying the appeal to heaven flag too. In the course of the 24 campaign, Donald Trump really leaned into these prophecy narratives, especially after the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania. But you can see he's posting images of himself, even during his trials. He's retweeting images of himself seated next to Jesus at the defense table. And you have these Christians saying that even Trump tells these Christians, you won't have to vote anymore if you just vote for me one more time. And he embraces the narrative after the assassination, and he keeps saying this. He says this in the inauguration. He says this in his acceptance speech after the election. God saved me to save America. It's the NAR narrative in Trump's voice. About a month before the 24 election, there's a huge gathering led by the NAR. There's about 75,000 people on the National Mall. I was there. It's called the Million Women March. It was on Yom Kippur. And Cindy Jacobs and Dutch Sheets and Che On and these other NAR leaders are kind of leading from the stage. And the apex of the stage, about a 10-hour day of spiritual warfare and prayer, Che On takes the stage, takes the microphone, and he declares, Trump is a type of a Jehu, Kamala Harris is a type of a Jezebel. And I decree it by faith that Trump will win on November the 5th. He will be our 47th president, and Kamala Harris will be cast down. She will lose in Jesus' mighty name. What he's referring to there is 1 Kings 9, the story of the execution of Jezebel, presided over by the newly anointed King Jehu. It's a brutal story where they have her servants throw her alive out of a tower. And when she hits the ground, Jehu and his men trample her with their horses, her body with their horses. And they go and eat a meal, and wild dogs come and eat Jezebel's body. And the message of the story is Jezebel is such a profane character, she has to be reduced to dog feces and all memory of her wiped from the earth. This is the imagery they're using of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris on the eve of the election. A few days later, there's another one of these gatherings of Christian leaders around Trump, and Che On, the same one who made this declaration, this violent declaration, this almost death threat on Kamala Harris, is photographed with his hand on Trump's shoulder, and Lance Wallnau was there too. When Trump takes office again in 2025, one of his first acts is to first reconstitute the White House Faith Office and make it more powerful than it ever was, and he puts Paula White-Cain in charge of leading it. He also announces a new task force for eradicating anti-Christian bias, led by the DOJ, led by many of the cabinet officials, to root out all the rampant anti-Christian bias in our government. 62% of Americans are Christian. There's no widespread anti-Christian bias in our society. And yet they're forming a government task force to fix the problem. Even last December, you have another one of these gatherings of Christian leaders with Paul White-Cain, and look, it's Lance Wallnau in the backdrop. And a bunch of these next generation NAR leaders. These are the people I keep track of, the people that keep me up at night. These are the new ambitious up-and-comers in this world. They're getting access to. In early March, Trump actually posted one of these prophecies, one of the original prophecies by a prophet named Kim Clement, who was a best friend of Lance Wallnau's. He posted it himself. He did not retweet this. He went and found it and posted the link to the video of the prophecy. And then, of course, just about a month ago, he posted this image of himself looking like Jesus that got so much attention. So as we conclude, let's review. Religious movements that threaten democracy are those that privilege one religious community and their citizenship over others, eradicating anti-Christian bias, not anti-Semitic bias, not Islamophobic bias, not anti-secular bias. Only Christians get protected. They use demonization or threats of violence to bring authoritarian leaders to power. Everything that we saw around January 6th, where they are literally demonizing their enemies. They baptize an authoritarian agenda and theology to make it seem like God's agenda. And I will say this as a student of American history, we have never seen this level of religious fervor around a national political leader in American history. And in extreme cases, religious movements can even help to drive an authoritarian leader mad with delusions of grandeur and invincibility. And Donald Trump seems to have adopted and maybe even sincerely believe the Messiah complex that his advisors have been cultivating for more than a decade now. When the Varieties of Democracy Institute did their analysis in 2025, this is the same institute, and they downgraded the US from a liberal democracy to what they call an electoral democracy for the first time in 20 years. Let me read two quotes from this report that I think illustrate what's going on. They say, the level of democracy for the average citizen in Western Europe and North America is at its lowest level in over 50 years, primarily due to the ongoing autocratization of the USA. We are dragging down the average of the Western world in terms of democracy. They also say this, the speed with which American democracy is currently being dismantled is unprecedented in modern history. Not modern American history, modern global history. We've never seen it happen this fast before. Let me give a few final thoughts and then we'll do the Q&A. Donald Trump, I would argue, would not be president today without Christian supremacist theologies, especially these charismatic prophecies that have sanctified him and made him a quasi-messianic figure in many Christian and evangelical circles. And yes, some very powerful and well-connected American evangelicals absolutely pose a profound threat to American democracy today. And there are many other evangelicals and other American Christians who are contributing to this threat by unwaveringly supporting Trump and MAGA. You don't have to buy into the prophecies to support Trump, but many do. And what we're living through right now is an almost unprecedentedly fast slide from liberal democracy into an illiberal democracy as the second Trump administration strips away the rule of law, the separation of powers, and citizens' free speech rights. American democracy has not faced such an acute and existential crisis in our democracy before. And so I'll conclude by saying I think we need a broad-based resistance movement to this, but we also need a theological resistance movement to this. The propaganda that is driving our nation mad is theological. And our response must also be theological. Thank you.
Dr. Taylor, on page 171 of your book, you mentioned that Lance would not be found at ETS. I don't know if you'd find any of these people at the Evangelical Theological Society or on the campuses of any of the top 10 largest seminaries in the country. Why do we still call them evangelicals? They don't seem to emphasize evangelical theology at all. And then I got a second question. Would you place Charis Bible College and Andrew Womack in this group?
Yeah. Let me start with the second part first. Yes, I would definitely put. So Lance Wallnau and Andrew Womack are very close. In fact, they co-founded together the Truth and Liberty Coalition, which is an activist organization. If you go on their website, right there in the mission statement, it's the 7 mountains. And so it's explicitly about conquering the 7 mountains. They do all kinds of local activism. They also do training exercises to train activists from around the country on how to conquer the 7 mountains. So yeah, they're steeped in these ideas. The part of the challenge we have, and this is why I started with the definitions of evangelicalism, is I think we have allowed quadrant 1 evangelicals and evangelical elites to define what evangelicalism is. And if you go back in the 1980s, 1990s, it was these kind of college-educated, often with advanced degrees, white evangelical leaders of a lot of the places like the organizations in Colorado Springs, who the national media would look to as like they are the guiding lights of evangelicalism. Those folks have been displaced today. This is the new breed. This is the new regime. And I would argue that the center of American evangelicalism has shifted from quadrant 1 into quadrant 4 in the last decade. This is the new mainstream. And so, yes, those institutions still exist. They're still part of evangelicalism, but they are not what's guiding the politics of evangelicalism today. And I've spoken at a number of those campuses, and there are professors and others on those campuses who are kind of mystified. They're like, I haven't heard of these people. I'm like, I know, because you're on the margins now. They're the mainstream. And so this is the shift, this changeover that is happening right now. And when you ask about, well, they're not espousing the ideas of evangelicalism, what are the ideas of evangelicalism? These folks will talk about being born again. They don't talk as much about the cross of Christ, but they talk a lot about miraculous power. They're more steeped in Pentecostal theology. And if you wanted to make a separation and say Pentecostals and charismatics are a different form of Christianity than evangelicalism, I guess you can make that argument, but that's not how most people talk. Most people would, and in fact, if you go into surveys today, among all denominations, all denominational identities, the people who are most likely to self-identify as evangelical are Pentecostals, followed by non-denominational charismatics. So they're identifying as evangelical. And I would say it's actually not my place to say what normal or mainstream evangelicalism is. Mainstream it's a numbers game. It's not a normative thing. Mainstream is just what's popular, and this stuff is what's extremely popular today and growing. And so I'd argue that, especially when we talk about evangelical politics, this is the driving force today.
Can you talk about NAR and Project 2025?
So Project 2025, if you're not familiar, is this, it's kind of a policy compendium more than anything else. I mean, it's a massive 900-page document put together by the Heritage Foundation, which is a kind of historic religious right institution, and that Trump in the 24 campaign claimed he had no knowledge of and had never read and was not invested in at all, and now has proceeded to enact almost entirely in his administration. It was written by people like Russell Vogt, who's the director of the White House Office of Management and Budgets. And so it comes out of the Heritage Foundation. So the thing about the NAR leaders is these are not policy wonks. These are not people who are writing white papers. They're prophets, they're spokespeople, they're oracles. And so these people are more the propaganda side of modern evangelicalism. They're the ones who are framing Trump with these kind of theological frameworks. And there are other people who do the kind of policy stuff, more the kind of legacy leaders of the religious right who are more invested in that. I will say this, after Project 2025 came out, and you can't find any direct NAR ideas that I've seen in there, but there's definitely ideas of Christian nationalism and Christian supremacy layered into Project 2025. After Project 2025, in the fall of 2024, right before the election, Heritage put out another report called Project Esther. Who here's heard of Project Esther? Not so many of you, huh? Project Esther is like the addendum of Project 2025. Maybe even you could call it like the little sibling of Project 2025. Much shorter, it's only about 30 pages. And Project Esther is organized by NAR leaders who are almost all Christian Zionists. And it's a plan to eradicate anti-Semitism in America, led by Christian nationalist leaders. In fact, mainstream Jewish community organizations refuse to get involved with Project 2025. I've had Jewish community leaders tell me it's the most anti-Semitic thing they've ever seen. And it's a plan to eradicate anti-Semitism. Led by Christian nationalists and Christian Zionists, this is the policy plan that we watched get enacted in the first few months of the second Trump administration, where they're putting pressure on colleges and universities to police anyone who's critical of Israel, anyone who expresses pro-Palestinian sentiment, to label them all as part of a Hamas support network, including going after Jewish activist groups who are protesting against Israel and labeling them anti-Semitic. This is the plan that is outlined about arresting international graduate students who are Muslims, who are critical of Israel, and deporting them. We watched all this get enacted. That one was created by NAR leaders, was facilitated by them. So it's not that they're embedded in everything, that you can't find them in every one of these institutions. There are other power centers, but they're very influential in certain pockets of policymaking, especially around foreign policy with Israel.
Can you speak to the Charlie Kirk movement?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can. Yes. Anything particular?
I know that could be another 2-hour thing.
So Charlie Kirk founded Turning Point USA when he was 18 years old, and built it into arguably one of the most influential institutions in MAGA land today. But Turning Point originally was more of like a kind of Tea Party, anti-Obama college and university program. It was not very religious at the start. And it was actually after he met Erica in 2019, as he started connecting with some of the leaders that I talked about here, that Charlie Kirk actually made a pivot and really embraced an evangelical identity and started speaking more about Christian roles in society and all these sorts of things. And so he helps found Turning Point Faith, which is kind of the religious activism wing of Turning Point. Kirk was an evangelical, but he was a more kind of ecumenical evangelical. He played with the NAR people. He even endorsed the Seven Mountains at one point. But he was a kind of big tent MAGA person. He wanted to have the Catholics and the kind of normie evangelicals and the mainline Protestants all kind of find a home in Turning Point. I mean, when Kirk was assassinated in September, there were a lot of people on the right, a lot of commentators on the right, who said, we lost a future president today. I don't think they were wrong necessarily. It's hard to explain to people who aren't in the MAGA world or who track it just what Charlie Kirk meant to the MAGA movement. He was the golden boy. He was the heir apparent in some ways. He was this very charismatic in the more conventional sense of the word. He attended an independent charismatic church in Phoenix, but he could speak fluently, not always accurately or factually, but fluently, and he was a remarkable organizer, a remarkable strategist. I don't think that Trump would have gotten elected in 24 without Turning Point USA and their ground operations to get out the vote. They kind of handed that off to TPUSA, and they were the ones who ran that. So he was incredibly influential. I wouldn't call him part of the NAR, but he was kind of one of these leaders who could kind of straddle the entire MAGA world and be respected across the spectrum. And I think his assassination was maybe the most significant event in American Christianity in 2025, and I recognize that we got our first American Pope that year. I'm counting that in the calculus. I still think the Kirk assassination was one of the most important events that year.
Can you be more specific about your last bullet point, that there needs to be a theological component in the resistance?
Yeah, absolutely. So a colleague of mine, Susan Hayward, and I, we did a podcast series that came out this last fall called American Unexceptionalism. And the premise of it was, so Susie, she was one of the directors of religion at the United States Institute of Peace, now renamed the Donald J. Trump United States Institute of Peace. This was the institute that was eviscerated by Doge and by Elon Musk early on in the second Trump administration. But Susie came out of that, and now she's a pastor in Minneapolis, and was one of the first clergy on site at the Alex Preddy and Renee Nicole Good shootings. And the premise of the podcast is that we're interviewing experts in religious nationalism around the world who are not experts in American Christian nationalism. We're inviting them to speak into our situation and learn from them. These are activists and scholars who are on the front lines of resisting religious nationalism, protecting democracy, who've been doing this for years. And we're saying, teach us. Speak into our situation. We'll be in the learning posture. You be our teachers. And it was really, it's a wonderful series. There's 10 episodes, and we're looking at Sri Lanka and Myanmar and Turkey and Poland and Brazil and South Korea and India. And there's a lot of rich content in there. But one of the questions that I kept asking and that I kept hearing the same answer from was, what's the role of theology? And across the board, these people are saying it's so important to have theology as part of the resistance to religious nationalism. Not just Christian nationalism. I'm hearing this from Buddhist scholars and activists against Buddhist and Hindu nationalism, right? And what they're saying is, when you have, and this is how it works, right? And we're seeing this around the world. We're seeing this, the rise of these far-right, populist, authoritarian, reactionary movements, often merged with a religious nationalist movement. And it depends on what the religious majority in the country is in terms of which religion they're attached to. But they're learning from each other. They're playing off of each other. There's a playbook that's developing globally from these leaders. And what they do is they enlist the religious majority against everyone else and say, you're the real citizens. You're the real Indians. You're the real Hungarians. You're the real Brazilians. And those people are just fake. And they don't have the best interests of our country in mind. And you should be afraid of them because they want to destroy our country. And so they enlist the fears of the religious majority, and they're using religious messages to do that. And if the other side, that's usually a kind of left to center, more diverse coalition, if they just kind of say, okay, well, you can use the religious language, we're going to talk about democracy. We need to protect the rule of law. And you can't say that Jair Bolsonaro can take over our country and be the king over our country because we have the rule of law here. They use the language of the Enlightenment to try to defend democracy. The problem is, those are all abstractions for people. How many of you in here would die for the rule of law? There's a lot of people who would die for Jesus. And if somebody's using a religious vocabulary to enlist you in this cause, and the other side is just using this kind of Enlightenment pablum, you're going to go with the side that's speaking your language. And so we need, in my view, to resist this theological propaganda using theology. And I recognize that's not a task for everyone. That's really a task for those of us who identify as Christians, because I don't expect other people to speak the language of Christian theology. It's going to come off as inauthentic. But for those of us who are Christians, who are offended by this, I think it is our theological duty and our moral duty to speak publicly and speak theologically against this stuff. And so, thank you. So, after the 24 election, I started writing my next book, which is coming out in October, and the title is Defying Tyrants, Following Jesus in a World of Christian Antichrists. And it's my attempt to use my own theological voice to push back on Christian supremacy, Christian nationalism, Christian imperialism, and to say, these things, yes, they're part of Christianity. The people who are doing them are Christian, but they're antithetical to the way of Jesus, to the degree that they are what in the New Testament actually is referred to as an antichrist vision. It is so opposed and I do a whole exegesis of the phrase antichrist in the New Testament, and it's more often used in the plural than the singular in the New Testament. And it's referring to Christians who abuse power in the name of Jesus, who bastardize the name of Jesus in their quest for their own power. I think it's a very useful term for understanding and diagnosing where we are right now.
I had attended your last talk where you had mentioned this sort of multi-pronged theology. Do you think that you could give us more specifics into the counter theology, namely in the American context, that does not just sort of devolve into a, well, Jesus is actually on my side, guys, but demonstrates something seminal in this Christian potentiality of a counter theology?
Yeah, and I'm not trying to kind of find the silver bullet theology to solve all of this stuff. I don't think that exists. What we see in Christian nationalism, Christian supremacy, is actually a cacophony of different theologies. This is one strand of it, I would argue the most influential strand of it, but you also have these kind of Calvinist theologians around people like Doug Wilson that are the kind of theological backdrop for Pete Hegseth. I mean, you can't understand what Pete Hegseth is doing today as the Secretary of Holy War without understanding the theology that has shaped him, that he is giving voice to, and he is enacting in policy within the U.S. military. This has not been as widely reported, but what Pete Hegseth is doing right now is he's culling from our military leadership any leaders who would disagree with him and disagree with Donald Trump. And also changing the culture of the U.S. military to make it more aligned with Christian nationalism. And if you study autocracy and authoritarianism around the world, that is one of the major stages of an authoritarian takeover. Part of what saved American democracy in 2020 was that we had a Secretary of Defense and a leadership in the Joint Chiefs of Staff who, when Donald Trump was trying to order them to deploy the military against protesters during Black Lives Matter and then during the election controversy, they said no because they were committed to the U.S. Constitution. Do you think Pete Hegseth would say no? Do you think the leaders that he has maintained and kept in the leadership of the military would say no today? I'm not confident. So, but there's a cacophony of these theologies. That's coming out of a very Calvinist style. There are Catholic Christian nationalists and Christian supremacists who are doing this from very Catholic frames. So I think what we need is people pushing back within their traditions, pushing back against the particular kind of frames and theologies that are emerging from within their traditions, pushing back in their denominations, pushing back in their churches, having these arguments. Part of what is happening right now, and again, you don't see it, but there are, especially after the Kirk assassination in September, I was watching all these leaders, Lance Wallnau, all these characters, and what they were saying to their followers, to their millions of followers, they were saying, what you need to do right now is gather a group of the most influential people in your church and go and confront your pastor and tell your pastor, if he does not, and they would say he because they didn't really acknowledge that there were that many female pastors, but if he does not preach in his sermon that Charlie Kirk is a Christian martyr, you and your group is going to leave the church. They were pressuring. It was a pressure campaign on pastors to name Charlie Kirk as a Christian martyr. And if there are not people in that church who are supporting the pastor and pushing back on that, most pastors, their livelihood is attached to this. And so they're going to kind of go with what's safe, and that's the safe choice for them. So we need to be doing this in our churches, and I think we need a variety of different theological voices, and I think there's some wonderful people who are doing this work right now. But I think I think we need to avoid it becoming a liberal or lefty version of Christian nationalism, because those do exist. That want to say, well, America's a real Christian nation because we have real Christian values of love and inclusion and diversity. I think what we need is actually religious leaders from across the spectrum. And we saw this in Minneapolis. My friend Susie was one of the leaders of it. We saw clergy, not just Christian clergy, Jewish leaders, Buddhist leaders, Hindu leaders, on the front lines of those protests, using their religious authority, using their religious voices, not necessarily taking over the protests to lead them, but adding their moral and religious authority into the protests. And I think it made those protests so much more effective. It became a model that I think every other city should be following as they themselves are confronting these ICE operations.
One of the things you said earlier was that the definition of evangelicalism has been passed from the first quadrilateral and elites to the fourth quadrilateral. I'd like you to put some context in terms of demographics, because there are a lot of boomers and millennials who are evangelical, but that's not the case for Generation Z and Generation Alpha.
Yeah, great question. So the question was, what are the demographic numbers on this? When I say that the center of American evangelicalism has moved from the first quadrant to the fourth quadrant, what does that look like demographically? Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of survey data to date that measures charismaticism. There's been a few surveys. There were some scholars at Public Religion Research Institute who did a very good survey trying to kind of quantify some of this stuff. So I'll give you some anecdata that might kind of give a sense of things. So one is we are seeing a shocking rise in non-denominational identity. I mean, if Ryan Burge, the sociologist of religion in America, has done, he's got a chart. And it's like a kind of slow rise through the early 2000s, 2010s, and by like 2015, it's a hockey stick of people identifying as non-denominational. And so we're seeing this real rise. And there actually is survey data on this. There's a census of American congregations run by this nonprofit. It's not a census of people, it's of congregations and of denominations. And so they're asking at the kind of institutional level, how do these kind of groups identify and how many people are in them? And in that survey, the Southern Baptists have always been the biggest American Protestant denomination as long as they've been doing the survey. And in 2010, when they did the survey in 2010, the Southern Baptists far outnumbered the non-denominational Christians. In 2020, the non-denominationals had passed the Southern Baptists. There are 21 million non-denominational Christians in their survey and 17 million Southern Baptists. Not all those non-denominational churches are necessarily charismatic, but the charismatic ones are the ones that are growing. And so we're seeing this shift, and actually, you mentioned boomers. The independent charismatics are the ones that are appealing to the youth. These are the hip pastors. These are the cool churches. These are the exciting churches. These are the churches that are attracting young people. And so, if you are a young Christian who's attached to Donald Trump and to MAGA, if you're getting radicalized by these ideas, you're probably getting radicalized by either the independent charismatics or the radical Calvinists. That's just the reality right now. Those are the ascendant movements in terms of leadership, in terms of sway with the administration. And so, it's hard to kind of track. My approach is I'm tracking the leaders, especially the powerful leaders that we see navigating our politics today. And you would not believe how many independent charismatic pastors and apostles and prophets have just come out of the woodwork and gone into front lines religious right activism. These are the new, not just the new leaders of the religious right in DC, these are the new leaders of the religious right on the ground. These are the people taking over school boards because it's the education mountain. These are the people who are trying to take over local government because the Seven Mountains scales, and they believe they need to take over the Seven Mountains locally as well as nationally. And so these are the people, these are the thought leaders in American evangelicalism today who have a lot of juice.
We are at 7:30. Apologies to you two who are going to ask a question. Can we please give Dr. Taylor a round of applause? Thank you. Thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful event. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Have a safe night. Appreciate it. Great.